fooled. Well, nearly all of us were fooled in 2018 when he took power, but we didn't realize the extent of the evil nature of the man and his messiah complex, nor the viciousness of the people behind him, which were largely Amhara elites that were pushing for this return to the 19th century zero-sum domination of all the other groups in Ethiopia. And it's been particularly disturbing that despite the amount of information coming out, that he's been not only given a peace prize in 2018 when he was cooking up a war plan with Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea, but now despite words about sanctions, the USA is really supporting him now, and we're having a free flow of weapons from Turkey, Iran, China into Ethiopia without any effective sanction from the West at all. It looks as though the Pentecostal Christian right in America has supported this man and his evil actions, and this has allowed the Amhara militia and Fano to run havoc and commit ethnic cleansing and, well, what amounts to genocide, basically, not only in Tigray, but now in Oromia, since the so-called peace in Tigray, which was basically a capitulation due to starving the people. It was a reward, really, for Abiy Ahmed using war crimes and crimes against humanity to finish off the opposition in Tigray. It's a gross abuse of international practice, and he shouldn't have been rewarded with the support that he's still getting from America. Not so much from the EU, perhaps, but certainly from the States.
Yes, of course. It looks like there's some kind of change in normalization of relationship with Ethiopia in terms of the US. But I don't know if they have all the information that they need to make the decisions. It looks like the Ethiopian government is making a stronger relationship with Russia and the Far East, China, and the Arab countries. In the last few
America
months,
is responding to this blackmail, if you like, and saying that they want influence and therefore they will support this abusive regime, which is the wrong way to be. If you're going to have a satisfactory foreign policy, you have to put human rights at the top of the agenda instead of what normally happens, even with Western democracies, so-called, where human rights are always subservient to other strategic and economic interests.
yeah, that for me it looks like the West still want to salvage Ethiopia and use it as a partner, but the current government is fast moving towards the opponents of the Western nations, especially Russia. In the last 1 month, the Russian government has given some military equipment to the Ethiopian government, and just last week, the Ethiopian People's House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House, met with his Russian counterpart, and probably they would discuss more stronger relationship. And the Russian Speaker of the Parliament said, kind of like he appreciated the fact that the war in the north of the country was resolved through an African process. It looks like the Ethiopian government is trying to be more strongly related with the Russia, China, and the likes. And I don't know if it's trying to blackmail the Western nations, especially U.S. But as you remember, just last month, the United States government met with African authorities, about 59 of them, and it included Abiy Ahmed. At some point, Abiy Ahmed was watching the World Cup with the president, and so it seems like the Western government, especially the U.S., is trying to normalize relationship with the Ethiopian government, but the Ethiopian government is slipping away and is still trying to make a more strong relationship with the Russia and others who are on the other side of the current dynamics.
It's moral blackmail.
Yeah. So with that, just last week, I believe a couple of days ago, the Ethiopian Prime Minister met with the monitoring and implementation committee of the peace deal with the Tigray government. And after that meeting, Abiy Ahmed has called for an increased aviation, an increased flight to Tigray. And what do you think is going on in terms of the war that happened in Tigray, in terms of the peace deal? Has the war completely stopped? Have the Eritrean forces withdrawn from Tigray? What is going on?
Well, for a start, it wasn't a peace deal. It was cessation of hostilities because the Tigrayans realized that they were being killed, and civilian population was being wiped out if they continued trying to fight. So basically, as I said earlier, Abiy Ahmed was rewarded for war crimes and crimes against humanity by the West saying that he's achieved a peace. But what he's done is created a situation which is in the end going to be very unstable. There's increased hostility between Tigray and Eritrea, and there is genocide in Western Tigray by Amhara forces. And these cannot be seen as advantages for peace or progress in terms of the future of the country. He's sowing seeds of the disintegration of Ethiopia. And he's been rewarded for that by the West, which is a terrible shame. There was an opportunity for legislation to go through in the US in December, asking for access to all areas of Ethiopia in terms of investigation of human rights abuses. But this was denied by the US legislature. And the meeting that you mentioned with the African leaders coming to New York, that was another opportunity for censure. But that was not, as you say, he was watching football with the president of the USA. What a weak message that sends in terms of putting human rights above strategic and other objectives of the USA. No, it's a travesty. It's an absolute travesty.
You raised your concerns about the wording of Abiy Ahmed for the war that he has been waging over Tigray for the last 2 years. I've seen sometimes still people are being held accountable for the Holocaust that happened several decades ago. Don't you think somebody would be held accountable in the future when things improve and the
Yeah.
democracy is has a taste? And there is also this frequent theme that arises that they say transitional justice, and I don't know what it entails and who would be in that context, who would be held accountable, like transitional justice when they talk about the peace deal with Tigray.
Well, there is none. And we should not compare what's happening in Ethiopia with the Holocaust, where there were 11 million people industrially killed and in an organized way, half Jews and half gypsies, homosexuals, and etc. No, we shouldn't compare it to the industrial killing of 11 million, although the death rate in Tigray, the number of people who've died in Tigray is probably 1 million now, if you include the combatants and the 500,000 or 600,000 plus Tigrayan civilians who've died because of this conflict. Goodness only knows how many people are dying in Oromia, and the population of Tigray is what, 6 million? So 10% of the population at least has been wiped out. Some people say 1/6. And Oromia, where there's what, 45 to 48 million people. And in the West,
I believe it's
what's
by
the thing? Sorry, yeah?
yeah by
How,
the if you look at the Ethiopian population, it has not been updated for several years. And recently, I just ran the numbers, and the Oromia population is almost 49 million to 50 million right now.
that's about right. I think the population of Ethiopia is now said to be 123 million.
Yeah.
And we know from State Department statistics and Amnesty International reports that the Oromo are 40% of the population of Ethiopia. So yeah, 49 million or so seems about right. And this is one hell of a problem brewing. There's what, 26, 28 million Amhara, and they seem to be dedicated to wiping out Oromo, to ridding the Oromo from Wolaga and Shoa, which is evidenced by, if you look where the attacks have been occurring by Fano and Amhara militia, and the drone strikes, of course. It's
Yeah, and we'll get back to your report number 61. In your report, you raised about the Fano terrorists and Amara security forces going back from Tigray and doing the same thing in Oromia as well. Over the last 2 years, the Fano Amara terrorists have been conducting raids and killing several Oromo civilians, especially in East Wallaga zone and Horoguru Wallaga zone, and that intensified in 2022. And some even people who are living in the Western countries report their families being killed. One Oromo intellectual who resides in California said his dad, who is about 85 years old, was killed in his own home, and his uncle, who was about 87, was also killed in his own home. Women were burned alive, and some were decapitated, and the Fano terrorists were carrying the head, chopped head over on the sticks and celebrating as if this is an achievement. People were burned alive in that portion of Oromia in Benishangul Gumuz zone, and the government has not done anything to stop them. What do you think is going on? And it doesn't get any attention from the external world, from media. And what do you
there is,
think? Are we? What do you think? Are we heading with that?
well, it's genocide. The level of abuse and the complete impunity of the people carrying it out, and the barbarity of the abuse, which seems to be celebrated by some of the abusers, taking selfies in front of decapitated heads and bodies being burnt in a pile. This and being proud of what they're doing. This is very, very dangerous stuff. And there we have similarities with Nazi Germany. Yes, although the numbers aren't the same. Yeah, it's horrific what's going on. I have a lot of hope for the UN Commission of Inquiry, which does seem to be very keen on getting good verifiable information from Oromia and other areas in Ethiopia, not just in Tigray. And we have another month or two to get information to that UN inquiry, which colleagues of mine are trying to do. It's and the report from Egypt is just a part of seeing that continuous process over the last 30 years, and seeing that it has not improved. In fact, under Abiy Ahmed, it's got considerably worse. Although
So
the number of interviewees I had in Cairo, very few of them have arrived since 2018, but most of them arrived several years before. But even those few accounts show that the level of violence against civilians is really intensifying in Ethiopia.
someone might ask, at this moment where there is a lot going on in Ethiopia itself, why do we have focus on Egypt and uh,
I can and I acknowledge this in the report, in the summary at the beginning. It may seem trivial, the problems faced by 10,000 Oromo refugees in Cairo compared to the millions who are being butchered, raped, and tortured in Ethiopia presently. And yes, but we still have to provide the information so that there is a historical continuum that's available to analyze. And the report actually is a distillation of the last 30 years of abuses, because it includes testimony from 26 interviewees in 2013 and 56 interviewees in last year, in September and October last year. And between them, they give a good thumbnail sketch of the abuses that have been going on over the last 30 years in Ethiopia. And I make no apology for producing this report now, despite the fact that it does not really concentrate on the current abuses. Although one of the most distressing interviews I had was concerning the war in Tigray, where we had a person who'd been tortured in order to make him go to the war front to be part of a medical team.
so
And he
how do you compare the human rights situation under the TPLF over the 27 years and under the Prosperity Party of the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed in the last few years?
this is apparent from reading any of the previous 10 reports, 50 to 60, or 11 reports from 50 to 60. And you can see that the rate of killings of youngsters is higher than at any time under the TPLF, apart from 92, 93, when there was a whole, similar to the atrocities that have been going on in the last year, when we had wholesale killing of OLF supporters then by the TPLF. And most of the summary executions that are in the Egypt report, reported by relatives over there, took place, in fact, in 1992, 93. But they've continued since then. And we see more detentions more recently in police stations rather than prison than were reported in 2013. And I believe that is because it's a lot easier to take somebody out of a police station and shoot him. And this has been happening to a great extent since 2018, accelerating in 2019, and then taking off really exponentially over the last 2 years. Well, 3 years, 2021, 22. And now we see what's happening in Wollo and in Shoa and all the zones of Wolliga. It's the extent and the number of abuses being carried out now is worse than under the TPLF, apart from, I say, that those first couple of years. But even then, I did maybe more than that now. It's very difficult to compare atrocities over the decades because there are different methods of communication and different degrees of effectiveness of getting the information across. So it's a bit, you're a bit on thin ice comparing regimes, but certainly since Abiy has come to power, we've seen a huge acceleration in the numbers killed, especially Kero supporters. And now over the last, since early last year, April, May, the number of people being killed in Oromia has rocketed. It's gone up enormously.
When we compare Abiy's regime, the Prosperity Party, and the TPLF, there is one that stands out to me, especially the conflict between the Oromo and the Amara. It is intensified under the Prosperity Party, and the Amara are more willing to kill people, attack people, and even we observed the most barbaric acts of violence, including burning people alive, decapitating people, and we there might be those might have happened under the leadership of TPLF, but we never saw them. And
No.
what do you think? Have they got this motivation from? Where did they get the motivation from? And like they feel of freedom to go out and do this and not held accountable.
I, for one, really underestimated the barbarity and hatred of Amhara forces. And when we were supporting the release of Andargachu Tsige from detention, and when Berhanu Nega spoke at an Oromo Studies Association conference in the early 2000s, we felt reassured that we were fighting against the common enemy. But what we've seen is both of those individuals subscribing to and supporting ethnic cleansing by Amhara forces. And this is happening before our eyes. So we saw it in Tigray, and now we're seeing it in Oromia. And as I say, I really underestimated the degree of hatred that is used to justify these barbaric practices. I knew that there was an Amhara mythology about the inferiority of the other peoples of Ethiopia, and the belief that if you're stared at when pregnant by an Oromo, by Galla, then you're likely to have a deformed baby. That belief is still extant in parts of Amhara region, and it is this degree of ignorance and bias, hatred that we have to combat with education. It's the worst sort of manipulation by politicians to encourage a genocidal killing. It's on a par with what happened in Rwanda and with the Interahamwe and the radio. What's been happening with Amhara spokespeople within the church, within the military, within the parliament is similar. It's on the same spectrum as that sort of whipping up of antipathy to Oromo and other peoples. It's not just the Oromo, but because they're so numerous, the Oromo are getting the majority of the abuses committed against them.
Why is it flourishing under the Prosperity Party's leadership?
Well, I can only conjecture. He was looking for support from everywhere. And if you remember, he had a lot of support in Oromia to begin with. And he was playing everybody off against each other. We all believed that Abiy Ahmed was a breath of fresh air in Ethiopian politics. And as I say, he was even given the Nobel Peace Prize. And that was supported and partly initiated by Oromo intellectuals that he got that. No, we were all fooled. And it's a an indictment against us as much, well, that we were fooled to that extent. And it suited him to encourage these Amhara extremists. There have been occasions, obviously, when he has opposed some of the extreme violence that they've committed. I believe in Wollo there's some resistance now from federal forces to what Amhara regional forces and Fano have been doing. There certainly was in the attacks in Wollo earlier on when they began in March and April. I think it was 2021. But atrocities, as you know, have continued over the last month, or been exacerbated over the last month, with the burning of Oromo villages again. We've already had tens, if not, well, scores of thousands of people killed and imprisoned in Wollo, in the Oromia special zone of Amhara region, that is. And it's very disappointing to see that happening again in the last month.
Are you following the current religious upheaval that's going on in Ethiopia? Just in the middle of January this year, the Oromo clergies came out and said they want to establish Oromo synod. They because of lists of reasons, including the people are not being served by their own language. The number of people assigned to serve the people are very small relative to the number in Amara region, and
the Orthodox religion is being used as a tool of oppression.
Yes, as a tool of operation, as a tool to enrich themselves and to grab land and this and all other reasons. So they established the Oromo synod and appointed bishop.
I can't say that I've been following it closely, but I've heard that some of the younger the priests in Oromia region have been very articulate in their criticism of what's been happening, and we hope that they will get some press coverage, because their take is very unbiased and very fair, and I believe there's a hope that they will be listened to as religious people. They won't be thought of being biased like I am or you are, for example, because they're religious leaders. Let's hope that they have some leverage with the media of the international community.
Yeah. So when that came out, the Ethiopian Orthodox Synod kind of protested, and the protest is ongoing right now. There is a demonstration that's being held in the capital and in all other and many other towns and cities, and one of those is Shashimane, which is to the south. And they now say the police fired on the demonstrators. And in the capital, it seems there is no any confront between the security forces and the protesters, but it looks like it is shifting and to be more violent. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, mostly the Amara ones, were coming out and saying, if you don't support us and stop those opponents, the new Oromo clergies and bishops who are leading the movement to establish the Oromo Synod. We will protest and even pay sacrifices up to life. That's what they are saying. And so it is first taking a political kind of, it's more being political rather than religious right now.
Well, it's being racist, basically. Let's not bandy words around. It's a racist group of people that are trying to take over. Unfortunately, they're the ones who control the media, and most of the media reports that will be received from Shashamane, just like after the Kero demonstrations, there will be accusing the Oromo of being terrorists, and the Amharas as being the peacekeepers and the ones in the right. We have to expect that sort of disinformation, which is, been the standard pattern over the last, well, even before Abiy Ahmed, but he is a past master at getting the media to say what he and what the Amhara regional forces want the media to say, despite the availability of evidence to the contrary. And we saw this in various massacres over the last few years. And every massacre of civilians has been blamed on the Oromo Liberation Army, whereas they've been perpetrated by Amhara forces or the so-called Oromia region version of the Oromo Liberation Army, which has got nothing to do with the real one.
Exactly. And just last week, Abiy Ahmed reacted to the situation, and in a striking contrast to his usual stand, anti-Oromo stand. This time he said the Oromo clergies have constitutional right to worship in their own language, to establish religious institutions, and the government is not going to intervene. He said the criticism on the government concerning support for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is not true, mentioning that the government has given back about 2 buildings that were taken over by previous governments over 40 years ago. And also he discussed about the amount of land that was given to the Ethiopian Orthodox Synod, which he said was just in the last 4 years, 1,045,000, as compared to 35,000 to all other religious groups combined, which is about 3 times. And still, right now, the government is receiving a huge criticism and opposition from the Ethiopian Orthodox and Amara groups all over Ethiopia as well as abroad. So I don't know why at this moment Abiy came out and kind of supported the Oromo group. It seems to be like it's not his type. But
remember that he rose to power on the back of the Pentecostal church, both in America and in Ethiopia. So we should not be surprised to see him trying to weaken the power of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. But even so, some of his biggest supporters in terms of the genocidal rhetoric against Tigrayans were members of the church, were they not? And I wouldn't trust what Abiy says about anything now. He's so discredited that he could be easily criticizing one group, and then behind the back, he could be stabbing the other ones. So I have very little positive to say about whatever he says.
exactly, this could be a facade to start with a good relationship, and then trying to coerce them to go back and continue, the usual. Probably that might be his move, but
Well, remember, he invited the OLF back to Finfinne, didn't he?
Well,
Imprisoning them and killing them.
Exactly. Yes. 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 And he's still using the same rhetoric and trying to say there is no objective for the OLA to fight, as if everything has been given to the Oromo people's request. And yeah, he's always mischievous. Let's get back to your report.
Oh yeah.
OSG report 61. So you interviewed several people, about 56 Oromo
Yeah.
refugees in 2022, in September and October 2022, and 26 in 2013. When I first read the summary of your report, I was, is Dr. Trevor saying 2023 or 2013? Why did you go back all the way to 2013?
One of my biggest regrets is having visited Egypt in 2013 and took these interviews from 26 refugees. And some of the information has been used in various documents, including the Universal Periodic Review of Ethiopia in 2016, I think it was. But their stories have never been published in full. And this is something I really regretted and felt guilty about. But I was too busy with asylum work for several years in the UK to publish the report. So when we were asked to go and interview refugees again in 2022, I wanted to go and to incorporate the information that we obtained in 2013 as well. It was a useful comparison too, because we were able to see that the number of refugees in Cairo, Oromo refugees, has gone up 5 times, from 2,000 to 10,000 within that 10-year period. And we were also able to see changes in the abuses against refugees as they cross Sudan. These have perhaps become more common, but less extreme. People aren't being tortured to death to extort money so much now. But we've been able to see the atrocious increase in violence and sexual violence against refugees in Cairo over that 10-year period. And this is often perpetrated by the people who smuggled refugees across Sudan in order to get to Egypt. So from a historical point of view, it was useful to have these two groups to compare. And as I said earlier, it enabled us to get a continuum, a snapshot, if you like, a thumbnail sketch of abuses in Ethiopia over the period reported by the refugees. And they were reporting abuses all the way through the 90s, the 2000 to 2010, and the 2010 onwards. And although it was a small sample of people who arrived after 2018, it was enough to see that things have certainly not improved and have got worse for the Oromo in that time. But the figures of extrajudicial killings, rape and torture were very consistent. If I can just mention some of the torture statistics of I looked at all the interviews I'd done in Africa since 2010. This included Kenya, Djibouti, Somaliland, South Africa, and the Egypt visits, both of them, the 2013, 2022. And there were 244 complete interviews. And of these, 169 had been detained. Of that 169, 133 had been tortured. So that's 79% of 169 detainees, male and female, had been tortured in detention. That's an incredibly high figure if you compare it to other international figures. If you looked at men alone, 73% had been tortured of the whole lot, And if you just looked at those that had been detained, 86% had been tortured. So that's nearly 9 out of 10 male detainees were tortured. 5 out of 10 female detainees were tortured, and 52% of women who were detained had been raped. And this is overlapping with the 50% who'd been tortured. Some were tortured and raped, some were just raped, some were just tortured. And I don't intend to say that rape is not a form of torture, but I separated them merely for able to look at the figures separately. But if you look at the ones in Egypt, I think it was 77% of former detainees, male and females, had been tortured. And yeah, this was 54% of the female detainees as well. So they're horrific uh, statistics of the number of people tortured and raped in Ethiopia.
In Ethiopia, and when we come to Egypt, what is the experience of the Oromo refugees and other refugees that you might have to look like? What is their experience and when they get to Egypt? Like,
Again, it's quite horrific. A high rate of assault, violence, sexual violence, abduction, attacks on the street were seen. The 26 interviewees in 2013 had reported 7 incidents of rape, assault, and abduction and attempted abduction. But in 2022, the 56 interviewees reported 70. That's 10 times as many, but agreeably, it was twice as many interviewees, but it was 10 times as many incidents of rape, violent assault, and abduction or attempted abduction. Refugee centres were closed down, burnt down by local people or people acting on behalf of the Ethiopian embassy in Cairo. It's a horrible place. Well, nowhere is a good place to be a refugee, but Cairo must be one of the very worst places. It's a huge incidence of violence and rape. And other NGOs reported this to me. They said it's one of the worst places in the world in terms of violence and sexual violence.
and you report, you also state that the Oromo refugees have no contact with the UNHCR, and you stated at some point the Oromo elders used to have a contact with the UNHCR, but due to some kind of corruption and malpractices, the kind of UNHCR cut ties with them. And right now, there's no Oromo community organization in contact with UNHCR. And you stated that only less than 1% of refugees who arrive in Egypt are granted any resettlement in any other
in any 1 year. Yeah, that applies to everybody. It's not just Oromo. I think it was 290,000 refugees in Cairo that registered refugees. These figures do not include the people who've been refused refugee status. So we're talking about those who've been accepted as refugees, which may be as little as half of the number that are there. And of those, of all nationalities, less than 1%, it's about 2,000 a year out of 290,000, are resettled. And obviously that's very few Oromo, because they're only, 4% of the total refugee total. And even the people who've been offered resettlement are often thwarted. I interviewed several people, 2 who'd been accepted to be resettled in Belgium, and then they were told just before they were going that the organisation could not afford to host them in Belgium. I interviewed one couple who had attend for a medical examination because they've been accepted in the UK, and every 6 months or a year they go for a medical examination, because to keep it up to date so that they can be resettled. And this has gone on for 5 and 6 years. And other people accepted in the USA and then refused, and it's horrible. It's a sort of torture being a refugee, and it's very disappointing, the interface with UNHCR. Local staff and some of the guards were approached by Oromo refugees wanting to be seen, and they were told, "Oh, go back to Ethiopia and turn the Nile back on, and then we'll treat your wife, or then we'll help you," or whatever. NGO people tended to say that the abuse against refugees was general, and the xenophobic attacks were everywhere against all refugees. But all the Oromos said that it was worse for them because of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam being built, and that's seen as a threat to Egypt's economy. It's not helped by Egyptian politicians playing this card to, for their cheap populist reasons. But
Don't the Egyptian government know that the Oromo, like the majority of the Oromo, are struggling to be independent from Ethiopia, and they are not the ones who are building the dam, and the Oromo have never shown any support for the building construction of the dam.
you would hope that, wouldn't you? But no, that's not the case. All Ethiopians are tarred with the same brush. And according to the refugee statements about their interactions with health professionals, nurses, doctors, police sometimes, although the police tended to be abusive and corrupt anyway, without mentioning the Nile as much as the other groups did. And you were asking about UNHCR contact, including a fairly senior figure in UNHCR. We were trying to establish contact with UNHCR while we were over there, and we were thwarted and turned back at every approach. And it's refugees said it's difficult to get seen there. And it seems the only way of getting seen is to join the big queue outside the main office, which is about 10 miles away from where most of the Oromo live. And the only way of getting seen is to hope that you're seen and not turned away, by standing in this queue. Certainly lots of phone calls and emails were sent, and we did not get a single response from UNHCR. Now, considering that there are 10,000 at least Oromo refugees in Cairo, I think that's a pretty poor show. I mean, I was very disappointed with UNHCR, I'm afraid.
I don't know what UNHCR is doing. Like in the last decade, I haven't seen any major thing that the UN has done. And
Well,
you know,
they're the only group that can facilitate resettlement. You've got to have refugee status, which is given either by a government or by UNHCR. In Egypt, it's all managed by UNHCR. And other places, it's done by the government. In Djibouti, for example, they insist on the ONARS, ONARS, the Djibouti authority, the immigration authority, looking at refugees. And of course, they don't grant hardly any Oromo now get refugee status in Djibouti. Same in Somaliland. There was a whole slew of refusals a couple of years ago in Somaliland, and because of UNHCR in Somaliland. And it seems that the Amhara and the Ethiopian government have undue influence with UNHCR. That's the only opinion I can come to. I'm extremely disappointed with the organization.
And do you think there is a pushback from the Western countries who have been generous in welcoming refuge, including the Oromo, the Tigray, Somali refuge? Do you think there is a pushback from Western nations, European nations, and the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand? These countries are the preferred countries and destination for refuge, for resettlement. Do you think there is a pushback? And also, have you spoken with those who have been resettled in this country? How do they fare when in their host countries?
Once you get to Canada or America, then I think people generally do well, not as bad as being in Cairo, and that the life is a lot better. But it's very, very few who manage to get there. And this thought that Western democracies have always welcomed refugees is inaccurate, absolutely inaccurate. If you look at the refusal rate by the British Home Office for Oromo refugees, well, any refugees, it was huge, and the majority were refused asylum at the first application. And now there's a bill going through the British Parliament saying that anybody who enters illegally, well, how the hell are you going to get into a country legally if you're a refugee? But anyone who's enters the country illegally is going to be refused, or there's no appeal for those. And those, you may have heard, there was this idea of exporting our refugees to Rwanda, of all places, where they would get a decision made on their asylum application. And these, the British government, I think, is apart, unless you're Ukrainian, is treating refugees appallingly shoddily, and it's got a long history of doing so.
Why are they doing that? Is that because the people, when they reach those countries, they exert some kind of economic pressure on the government? They don't work and earn for themselves, but rely on.
Just like Brexit, it's responding to racist and racism and xenophobia, basically.
Okay,
Any,
to
any,
the country like more homogeneous.
yeah, any sensible person will tell you that Britain needs immigration. Our population is dwindling. Our population is not going up, except for the people that come in from the outside. The average fertility for a British couple is less than 2. And that means that your population will go down, and nobody's going to look after you and wipe your bottom when you're in a nursing home. And we are dependent on refugees coming to Britain. And yet, populist politicians like to garner votes by showing how nasty and hostile they can be to refugees. And this is throughout all the political parties that have been in power since I started getting interested in the 1990s. The refusal rates for asylum have rocketed. And if you look at the reasons given, any 3-year-old, no, any 10-year-old could see through the holes in their logic. See the holes in their logic. It's disgusting the way we treat refugees in the UK. And I believe America's
Can
in a
we
lot
say
of
under?
people coming over the Mexican border and being put in prison, even children under Trump. Anyway, it's shocking.
Can we say under Rishi Sunak, the policy has gotten worse, given that like he's from an immigrant family? It looks like that to me.
You would expect
Worse, or is that improving, or what changed under his leadership?
No, it's got worse over the last 20 years under Tory government since 2007, Conservative government, or the coalition with the Lib Dems up to 2010, was it? But since the 1990s, it's got worse. It got worse under Tony Blair, after he admitted, I think it was over 200,000 immigrants, if you include dependents, in about 2002. And it was a pushback against that that began the rot in the asylum system in the UK. And we saw increasing rates of refusal since then. And since the Tories have been in power since 2007, that's been much, much worse. And including people in the present government and the previous several Tory governments that have been immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. Boris Johnson was the child of an immigrant.
Is he from Eastern Europe?
Yeah, yeah.
From
And Michael Howard, he was Home Secretary under the Tories. He's a child of an immigrant. Portillo, one of Margaret Thatcher's henchmen, was a child of an immigrant from Europe, from Spain.
It's surprising.
Present Foreign Secretary, not Home Office Minister, Suella Braverman. She's, I don't know what generation immigrant, but from immigrant background. Yeah. So that's no protection. Richie Sunak, as you say, he's from the Asian subcontinent, or his parents were.
Yep, it's surprising that it's not improving even under his leadership. But it looks like this is more widespread than just limited to the United Kingdom, and it looks like probably this what is also influencing the UNHCR's decision in determining who should be resettled and how many have to be resettled.
I think with UNHCR, it's more the humanitarian aspect, the humanitarian ethos of the organization has given way to people who are just interested in their careers within the UN. And so we have career diplomats working through, and the humble people who try and do their best for refugees at a caseworker level are not getting into positions of authority.
So I am not sure if I've asked you about this. When we in your report, you mentioned about the injection of lethal poisons to Tigrayan armies were captured during the war between 2020 and this last year. What is the magnitude of that, and what is there? Are there many Tigrayan refugees in Cairo?
I didn't see any, but I wouldn't have had contact with them. I believe there are 15,000 from Ethiopia in Cairo, 10,000 of whom are Oromo. Those are the figures I was given. The report of the Tigrayan soldiers was from a man who was tortured in order to persuade him to go to the front as a health professional. He witnessed between 40 and 50 injured Tigrayan soldiers, none of whose injuries were life-threatening, that they were all salvageable. They were all potentially treatable.
Could have recovered.
They'd been interrogated, these injured soldiers. This was all within a 6-month period in one place on the war front between January and June 2022. These between 40 to 50 were ordered to receive an injection, and the pre-filled syringes were handed down to the ones who were instructed to inject them, and they died within 2 or 3 hours. And this is over a 6-month period, between 40 and 50.
So this is just one account, and the magnitude of this problem might be even larger than that.
Yeah, this is one out of, there must have been hundreds of people at the front, and after soldiers and whatnot. And so these guys were brought back for interrogation and then murdered, and that is a war crime.
Yeah, this is just becoming, just normal, the usual, and nobody even, talks about this longer. In Ethiopia, this kind of things happen and it just goes away, and the usual continues, and the government does this with impunity and it doesn't get held accountable. Sometimes recently, I read one statement that was released by Amara groups based in the US and elsewhere, and they are trying to push to get the international community to categorize the OLA as terrorists. And I'm surprised because the OLA even treats the captured Amara armies, interviews them, and they don't show any demonstrate some kind of anxiety when they are captured. They enjoy the protection just like as if they were Oromo and military of the government or southern nation, but they still want to push to smear the name of the OLA. What do you think in terms of your assessment, the handling of those who have surrendered the OLA, and as compared to when it comes to the government and the forces from the Amara region and the Fano extremists?
All the reports that we've heard from credible sources about the Oromo Liberation Army have not included killing of civilians or killing of prisoners. But we don't get many reports. We can't say it never happened. But whenever we've investigated reports of so-called abuses by the Oromo Liberation Army, we've found those to be false. They've either been deliberately performed by people pretending to be Ola fighters, or they've been reported inaccurately, and they've basically given false information about the victims and about the perpetrators. We've seen this in the Tole massacre. We've seen this
Exactly. I was about to ask you about Tole.
in November 2020, and we saw it in August last year in the Agamsa massacre in East Wallaga. Relatives of people in East Wallaga have written an excellent report about the Agamsa killings, which is on the OSG website if you look in the reports section. And these have produced verifiable and credible accounts of what really went on. And looking through the false accounts by the Amhara Association of America, for example.
Thank you. And finally, now, what recommendations do you have for the Ethiopian government and the international community to address the human rights violations and concerns in Ethiopia? And what recommendations do you have for the Egyptian government, for the UN, in terms of the human right, and the treatment of Oromo refugees and other refugees in Cairo, in Egypt?
I doubt if the Egyptian government would take any notice of my pleas for a more humane treatment of refugees in Cairo. In terms of the UN and other countries, they should listen to the victims. They should speak to refugees themselves and find out the real story. It's always been the same. If you speak to refugees, you will get the real story. You'll understand what's happened to them. But very few people do. If you remember, in the time of the Derg, it was only when Bonnie Holcomb and other people were writing about the atrocities against Oromo in Western Oromia then, in the 1980s and 70s. They got their information from refugees in Sudan, and it's a pity the people do not speak to the grass that gets trodden. They only speak to the elephants that are doing the treading.
Thanks so much, Dr. Trevor.
I'm sorry we've gone on rather a long time. I do apologize to your viewers.
No. Thanks so much. We really appreciate for your work, for your dedication to the human rights of the Oromos and other oppressed people in Ethiopia. And thank you so much for today, and I appreciate it. I look forward to speaking with you again. And everybody, thanks so much for watching.
It's always a pleasure to speak to you, Daniel, and best wishes to all your viewers. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Have a good night.
Thank you. So, we done? Was that okay?